So if within an intentional, perfect universe, one made up of codes and laws designed by intelligence, if this idea of a conscious self is subject to harm, then what does that tell you about an idea of a conscious self? The idea that a conscious point of perception can be harmed is not an indication that the context is wrong, but an indication that conscious points of perception are being used wrong. And even if used right, it is not a superior way of consciousness. What it essentially amounts to is cheap thrills and hard pains, and for no other purpose but for gratification of this idea of a self. It all amounts to masturbation. Sensation, then no sensation. Sensation, opposite sensation. Addiction just for the sake of addiction. But needs, deprivations, do not exist in themselves. They are created to fit a need. Only within a structured illusionary dreamlike creation can the fulfillment of a need be sustained. There is a spectrum, a context. Both subject and object are provided, both being essential ingredients for a need to be fulfilled. But what is the overall need that's being fulfilled? The need to have a constructed context wherein which a need can be experienced. A need is really just an attachment. The attachment is what creates this idea of a self. What sustains an idea of a self is a context, and this is ultimately what consciousness has become attached to. Attachment to context. And of course, if you are attached to something, then you have to play by its rules. The rules and the laws are the glue that allows a conscious self to hold itself together. A progressively evolving continuity within a context. And if you don't want to play by those rules anymore, then you have to detach from context, which lets go of this idea of a conscious self. And most people have resigned themselves to the idea that the whole point of consciousness is to attach and feed this idea of a self. And they stay attached because it cannot be proven to them that there are higher ways of consciousness. What it really amounts to is justification from something within the context to keep on feeding. This idea that this idea of a self is the most optimal way of consciousness comes to you from something within the context. The context is the only thing that you can reference to make a verification. Conscious selves use context to verify the self. A reflection, an echo, a ripple, a cause, and a condition. So from within an idea of a self, an idea of a self becomes. The harms that an idea of a self are exposed to are ultimately there to repel consciousness, to spur it and steer it into a different direction, towards detachment. Detachment is the way towards higher consciousness. Asking why to this is the same as asking why does water run downhill. But people would rather resist and question the idea of higher consciousness. It gets dismissed because of the lack of a frame of reference for it. Most people's frame of reference being constant indulgence, wrapped up in a security blanket, like rats in a maze with no bird's eye view. Because self-awareness is what they have and it's all they've ever known. They are, in effect, locked into an idea of a self. So how does one detach from an idea of a self as a starting point? The key to detachment is found in not resisting. Resistance is holding on, tensing up, thrashing around. The very act of tensing up, holding on, and thrashing around is a cause. Any cause will create a condition. An idea of a conscious self will always be subject to a condition, for as long as it resists detachment. Tensing up and holding on is an attachment. It is a cause that creates a condition. Thrashing around creates vibrations. So the way to detachment is found within letting go, loosening up, and to be still. No causes, no conditions. Not holding on, nothing to hold on to. Not tense, nothing to be loosened. Not thrashing around, nothing to be brought to stillness. No attachment to a context, no idea of a self. It is only when one begins to walk down the path towards detachment that one begins to experience the most optimal way of self-consciousness, what we could truly call the most ideal, superior, advanced state that an idea of a self can exist in. But even the existence of a conscious self is only an ideal. Within non-stop, constant change, nothing ever stands and remains. An ideal state is never going to be found within the dualistic context that you're attached to. You're never going to achieve all light, no dark, all feeding and no hunger, all pleasure and no pain, all good and no evil. To insist that some ideal state can be sustained is to be in denial of duality. If you insist on staying in denial, then there's nothing for you to explore or figure out. Just feed for feed's sake and use it as justification for your addiction to feeding. And for as long as you're doing that, you really have no business criticizing one half of duality. You cannot embrace the sweet and reject the sour. If you take the sweet, you have to take the sour with it. If that's fine with you, if you'll take that, if you'll take the sour with the sweet, so long as you get the sweet, then that's all that you can hope for your conscious experience to ever be. And if that's the case, then you really shouldn't waste any of your time dealing with things like morals, ethics, judgments, values. Just feed by any means necessary. Just do whatever it takes to survive. And if that's fine to you, then that's what it will be. If that's not fine to you, if sweetness does not make up for the experience of sourness, then the only way to not experience sour is to give up both sweetness and sour. But people who take things personally don't want to do this. They would rather cling to an ideal and complain. It could be said to be another way man has found to survive. Personal survival. But between impersonal survival and personal survival, impersonal survival is more effective. If a bear is chasing two men in the woods, the man who impersonally does whatever it takes to survive might survive. The man who gets offended and complains about the bear will not survive. But the way out of both personal and impersonal survival is found within becoming a universal perspective. To recognize and maintain an awareness of wholeness. The path towards detachment, the way of peace, stillness, tranquility, all leading to a neutral, non-resistant death. If upon death consciousness is still, without desire, not drawn to make any new causes, then it will transcend self-awareness. But detachment is not just going to happen all by itself. It requires some spiritual work, cutting attachments to the things of this world, letting go of desire and passion. An ideal state could be said to be harmony, balance. Balance and harmony are created within centering. And when things are balanced, centered, and harmonized, then the detachment can take place.